Today, I'm coming to you with 3 unforgettable books. 3 great books that I have read and I think you should read too. Some books make such a big impression on me that I think about them often, even long after I have read them. Actually, this happens only with a few books. Many of the books I read are not that memorable, and I tend to forget all about them almost as soon as I finish them. If this happens to you too, please leave a comment because I would love to talk to you about the kind of books that leave a lasting impression and why. Talking about books here on YouTube, as I do weekly, helps me to fix them in my memory. So I have chosen 3 books that I read long before I started this channel. I'm a big fan of rereading my favorite books, and the more I read, the more I appreciate rereading. But the books that I have for you today became memorable upon my first reading. In fact, I've only read one of them more than once before. Okay, so the first book is the only novel written by the American poet Sylvia Plath. I am referring, of course, to The Bell Jar. Reading this novel is such an experience. It is such a personal, raw, affecting novel, unlike anything else I have ever read. I knew Sylvia Plath from her poetry. I studied her at university, but I only read her novel The Bell Jar years later. Plath committed suicide in 1963, shortly after her novel had been published in the UK. Publication in the US took a bit longer, and her mother tried to stop it from getting published. Sylvia Plath struggled with mental illness. She suffered either clinical depression or was bipolar, and in this semi-autobiographical novel, she goes into a lot of detail about that. Sylvia Plath was married to the English poet Ted Hughes, and there is a lot about their difficult, to say the least, marriage in her poetry. But in this, her novel, she talks about her college years way before she met her husband. The Bell Jar is an example of what critics call a roman à clé, or a novel with a key. A roman à clé is a novel based on real events and real people, but where the names have been changed to something fictional. So the main character in this novel is not Sylvia Plath, but Esther Greenwood. And all the other characters, including Esther's mother, are based on real people. And that's why this novel is so painful to read, because we know that what we're reading about actually happened, and that the writer, Sylvia Plath, felt the way her main character feels in the novel. Now, a novel like this could go horribly wrong for many reasons. Imagine what would happen if you wrote a novel about people who are close to you, about your family, your friends, your boyfriend, but you didn't paint them in a flattering light. When most people read The Bell Jar, Sylvia Plath was already dead. But I can only imagine the conflicts this novel could have brought on if she had lived longer. Of course, I'm not going to spoil the novel here, but I want to say that The Bell Jar is not a downer, okay? Granted, parts of it can be painful to read, but I don't find this novel to be depressing. More than by its portrayal of mental illness, I was struck by the novel's approach to women in the 1950s. So Esther Greenwood, the protagonist, is a promising, bright young woman who deserves to have such an amazing future. However, she's constantly being pulled back by the extremely restrictive roles that were reserved for women at that time. The second book is A Year of Magical Thinking by the American writer Joan Didion. This book is a memoir about the year following the death of Joan Didion's husband, the also writer John Gregory Dunne. I am sure I'm not alone in considering The Year of Magical Thinking the best book about grief. At least it is the best book about grief that I have read. Now, Joan Didion and John Gregory Dunne got married in 1964 and stayed together until his sudden death in 2003. Joan Didion waited exactly 1 year and 1 day after her husband's death before she began writing this memoir. In her book, Didion looks back almost clinically on the previous year and writes about her experience dealing with grief, which also coincided with her daughter's hospitalization following a serious condition. Again, this is a book that could have gone horribly wrong, but it did not. In this case, the writer doesn't fictionalize anything or change people's names. The Year of Magical Thinking is not a novel, which I think makes it even more poignant. On a personal note, I read this book when I was grieving, and it didn't exactly help me because the book is written from the perspective of someone who is on a different stage of grief, or perhaps not even grieving anymore. But reading The Year of Magical Thinking gave me hope. It showed me that time was going to make a difference. I only experienced that for myself much later after I read the book, but reading it made me look forward during the darkest period in my life, and that is not a small thing. The Year of Magical Thinking is so beautifully written and structured, so clear and moving that I would recommend it to everyone, no matter what their background or their experience with grief may be. Up next is one of the best and probably the craziest book ever written in the English language, Tristan Shandy by Laurence Sterne. This is a novel from the 18th century, and I know that most people don't read books published before the 19th century, at least. I think that is such a big mistake. The thing is that if you read a lot of postmodern literature, you are more than equipped for Tristan Shandy, because many of the things that writers such as Paul Auster, Thomas Pynchon, or Don DeLillo do now, Laurence Sterne already did more than 200 years ago. It is hard to talk about Tristan Shandy because it is a long, rambling novel, and I think people should read it knowing as little about it as possible to enjoy it. The reason I know so much about this novel and remember it so well is because I studied it and even wrote my master's thesis on it. So I had to read it several times and really worked on the text. But I have not read it since I got my master's, and that was such a long time ago. And I still remember it clearly, which is why I have not felt the need to read it since. Listen, I know that a lot of people struggle with this novel. Tristan Shandy is not easy to read because, among other things, it is full of digressions. So while I do say that you should try to go into it knowing very little about it, you should probably work on your expectations before you tackle it. This novel is about someone's life, but it doesn't even begin with that person's birth or their childhood. It begins right in the moment of their conception. That's on the first page, so I'm not spoiling anything. Tristan Shandy is a wild ride, one that you need to be in the mood for. You're going to have to concentrate on what you're reading a lot and possibly have to go back and reread sections of it because you are likely to get lost. But if you're willing to put in the necessary work and effort, Tristan Shandy is also one of the most rewarding novels I have ever read. I have reviewed Tristan Shandy for people who have never read it, and also The Bell Jar, so I'm going to link to these reviews right here, right now, in case you'd like to check them out. Thanks for watching. Bye.